Kia ora koutou, ko Douglas Walker, tōku ingoa. Here again with the wonderful Emma Campbell from Wellington Girls College. And Emma has led us through 2 of the external standards for level 3 biology already. And tonight we're looking at human evolution. So as ever, if you could type any questions into chat, I'll monitor those and I'll interrupt Emma if it's a time sensitive question. Otherwise, I'll collate any questions and ask Emma them at the end. So straight over to you then, Emma, and thank you once again for your time and your expertise.
Cool, thank you, no worries at all. Really happy to be here. So thank you for those of you who are tuning in. If you have come to my earlier sessions, you'll kind of know the format of how I like to run them. But if not, then welcome along. So I will just share my screen with us. One moment. Sorry about this. There we go. Fantastic. Okay, so today I'm going to take you through Bio 3.6, which is demonstrate understanding in the trends in human evolution. And I really want to emphasize that this topic is about trends. It's not about memorizing minute detail of every single one of our ancestors, but instead thinking kind of on a larger scale, the bigger picture. How have we seen changes over time, and how can we use the evidence given to us to draw conclusions based on it? So apologies, I've written 5 credits. It's actually 4 credits. So as ever, I like to start this topic off with a very visual representation. So I split this topic into 3 main groups. Firstly, looking at the biological evolution, so looking at changes over time in regards to mainly bipedalism and also changes in the diet of our ancestors. A really good way to think about that is to compare ourselves to our current living cousins. So we'll have a chat about chimpanzees and gorillas and how their biological features compare to our own. I also want to talk about the cultural evolution side of things. So looking at tool cultures, fire, language, abstract thought, etc. And then finally into our dispersal theory, so migration patterns and migration pathways. And then really emphasizing how these topics are not mutually exclusive. Instead, they feed into one another. So, for example, biological evolution is really closely linked to cultural evolution. It was development in the brain that led to changes in knowledge and understanding. The exact same with biological evolution, cultural evolution that allowed our ancestors to leave Africa and to spread around the earth. So recognizing that these topics feed into one another, and it is about a really a positive feedback cycle. It's not like they evolved in biologically and then culturally, and how they these ideas feed into one another is really important. So a couple of our key players that you might want to be familiar with, particularly with regards to cultural evolution. So you may have heard of some of them, you may not, some of them may be new to you, that's okay. But ones that I tend to talk about or think about are Ardipithecus ramidus, so Ardi, Australopithecus afarensis, so that's the one that the fossil is often referred to as Lucy, Paranthropus boisei, sometimes referred to as Nutcracker Man, not considered to be an ancestor of ours, but instead a branch of that hominin evolutionary tree, and a really interesting comparison between the specialist herbivores that we see in the Paranthropus group compared to the early members of the Homo genus, which were much more generalist. Okay, so Homo habilis, hopefully you are familiar with habilis in regards to thought to be, widely considered to be the earliest of our tool users. Homo erectus and Homo ergaster. You may have talked about Homo ergaster as Homo erectus. Some people consider them to be the same species. Some resources talk about them as separate species. Homo ergaster was found exclusively in Africa, so is often referred to as African Homo erectus. They're very similar, and there is discussion going around as to whether they are distinct enough to be considered separate species, but more and more so they are considered to be separate recently. Homo heidelbergensis, another ancestor in the Homo neanderthalensis, or the Neanderthals, which I'm sure you would have talked about as well. Finally, Homo sapiens. So this is where we stand right here. So you don't need to memorize really specific details about each of those, but instead just be familiar with their names, maybe recognize like some certain cultural features about them, particularly members of the Homo genus once they start to use tools and things like that. But we'll talk about that later on. So I mentioned earlier the importance of talking about the biological evolution. So we can look at the skull, we can look at the skeleton, and we look at the brain for this. And we have a look at how they've changed over time. Now, the easiest way for us to do this is to compare to our closest living relative, which is a chimpanzee. So here we've got a chimpanzee, a skull, and a human skull as well. Now, the ancestor, when we last shared an common ancestor with these other primates that are alive today, that ancestor was neither chimpanzee nor was it human. So it's really important to recognize that. I think a lot of people are of the misconception that we evolved from chimpanzees. That is not the case at all. We shared a common ancestor many millions of years ago. I think it's off the top of my head around 6 to 8 is the 8 maybe, it's the kind of general consensus, but that date does shift and change as we gather more evidence. But it does tell us a lot around how our change in diet and bipedalism has caused changes in our skull, skeleton, and brain. So I will stop sharing there for just a moment and introduce you to my friend here, which is a gorilla skull. So, and we'll go through some of the key points. I think this is a very visual part of the topic, so hopefully it allows you to see some of the key points that I'm going to make. So in the images on the slideshow, I've got a chimpanzee, but I borrowed the gorilla from school today because the gorilla has really prominent features and really exaggerated changes. So you may not know much about gorillas, but they are herbivores and they are quadrupedal, which makes comparing their skull really interesting compared to our own, which is omnivore and bipedal. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is this really prominent brow ridge here. Okay, so a brow ridge is important in our herbivores because it's needed to support the really strong chewing muscles. Plant material is really hard to break up. It's really hard to chew. So to be able to chew it and to digest it properly, they need to have really large, strong chewing muscles. We don't have that. Our food is much softer, and so our chewing muscles are much smaller. So that brow ridge is needed to support those strong chewing muscles. There we go. That run up the side and up to the center of the skull. Okay, our brow ridge is less prominent. That's because we've had our forehead kind of fill out a little bit. We've got really large brains, so we need a really large cranial capacity or brain case in which to hold our brains. The next part I want to talk about is the zygomatic arch, which is the official name for your cheekbone, essentially. So what happens is the zygomatic arch runs along the side of the face. Your jaw muscles go from the chewing muscles go from the mandible or the lower jaw up under that zygomatic arch and attach high on the head. So large chewing muscles mean a large zygomatic arch for it to fit under. Okay. So if you were to place your hands on the side of your face and to chew, you would feel your chewing muscles here. You would feel them up here, but you would not feel them under that arch as they run under the bone. Okay. We've also got a really large, really pronounced sagittal crest. So all muscles need something to attach to and bone to pull against. Otherwise, they're not able to function. So chewing muscles go from the mandible under the zygomatic arch and attach to the sagittal crest here. Now, in a gorilla, this is a really large, prominent crest. That's for the large muscles to attach to. Our muscles attach to our temporal part of the skull, so just pretty much beside the eye there. It's a much smaller crest, okay, and not nearly as prominent. It also means if you gently place your hand to the side of your eye, you can feel your chewing muscles. If you were a gorilla or a chimpanzee, you'd be able to feel them way up here as it attaches to that crest down the center of the skull. Okay. Finally, the last change to do with their diet is around the mandible here. Okay, so they have really large jaws to support that large chewing muscle. If you have a look at that shape, they have a very rectangular shaped jaw to hold their very large teeth. So herbivores have large molars, flat molars used to grind down plant material, kind of like a mortar and pestle, to really break down that plant material for mechanical digestion. Okay. Our lower jaw is much smaller. Okay. It's parabolic, meaning it is not rectangular, more U-shaped. Okay, and then not nearly as big. Okay. So they are the changes in the skull that we associate with diet, but there's also changes in the skull that we associate with being bipedal. So while our primate cousins are able to walk on two legs, they're not habitually bipedal, meaning it's not their natural gait, whereas it is our natural gait to walk on two legs. So with that has come certain changes in our skull to support that bipedalism. Okay, so the first difference that you'll notice is along the back of the skull here, they've got the nuchal crest. Okay, so we don't have a nuchal crest. The back of our skull has rounded out. And so what that means is the nuchal crest is needed for neck muscles to attach to. So remember I said all muscles need to attach to a bone. So when a gorilla or a chimpanzee is on their four limbs, the spine enters at the back of the skull and is held upright by muscles, then large neck muscles that hold it upright. Our skull relies on balance. So we don't have large neck muscles responsible for holding our neck up. Instead, our head up, instead our skull is balanced on top of the spine. So our nuchal crest has, again, as their cranial capacity, our skulls have gotten bigger to fit our large brains, it has really filled out. and hidden that prominent nuchal crest. The other big difference is the foramen magnum. So the foramen magnum is the hole in which the spinal cord enters and attaches to the brain. In a quadruped, like a gorilla or a chimpanzee, it's at the back because the spine runs behind the skull, like so. In a human, it's at the bottom, in the center, as once again, our skull relies on balance, okay, balancing on the spine to hold our head upright. So it's being moved forward and into the center. It means that we don't have to spend a lot of energy holding our head up. Instead, balance does that for us. A good way to remember the name of foramen magnum is it literally translates to big hole in the head. Okay. And finally, we've got the prognathic angle. So the prognathic angle refers to the snout. Okay, so you'll notice the gorilla here, there we go, its face angles forward. In a human, the prognathic angle is very vertical. Okay, so again, this means that we don't have a lot of snout in front of our spine, and so our skull is better able to balance. It also is able to happen because of diet. We've got smaller jawbones, smaller teeth, so we don't need that large jaw in order to hold it. Okay. So a very crash course in the skull, but trends are over time. Often the questions link into talking about changes in diet or changes in bipedalism. So you want to be familiar with those changes and why we've seen those changes. So just an explanation of those key ideas that I've gone through. If you're watching this back later, you can always pause and have a read through. Okay, so the next idea is changes in skeleton. And unfortunately, I don't have a gorilla skeleton handy. It would be good. But hopefully the pictures will do it justice. So a lot of the changes in the skeleton in the human, here on the left compared to the chimpanzee on the right, are to do with bipedalism and the fact that we live a very different lifestyle from them. So we are really well suited to walking long distances on two legs. It may not always feel like that, but we are. We are really energy efficient walkers. Whereas a chimpanzee is well suited to moving through the trees. Okay, so we see changes in their body associated with that. Okay, so the first thing that you want to be aware of is the shape of the spine. So humans have an S-shaped spine, okay, whereas chimpanzees or other quadrupedal hominids have a C-shaped spine. So if you were to run your hand down your spine, you would see that it curves. Okay. Now that S shape in the spine is really important because it means that as we are walking along, the spine is absorbing a lot of the shock as our feet make contact with the ground. So again, it helps us with those long distance walking along the ground. The next one is the pelvis. So there's been a change in the shape of the pelvis. You can see in our human here, the pelvis is much shorter in these distances and much more flared out. So short and wide, that bowl-shaped pelvis. And that's responsible for supporting a lot of the weight of the upper body. Whereas in quadrupeds, the pelvis isn't responsible for holding the body upright like it is in bipedal walking. The next one is the valgus angle. So you'll notice that with the femur from the pelvis down to the knee, In the human, they angle inwards. Okay, so the femur angles inwards. It means that when you stand on one foot, that foot is directly under your center line of gravity. Okay, what this does is it stops you from having to sway from side to side in order to counterbalance when you stand on one foot. So as you walk along, often you're on one foot, and that foot is in the center of your body, so it holds you balanced. A chimpanzee doesn't have that. Its femur runs directly down from the pelvis to the knees, and so as they walk, you may have noticed they have to sway from side to side to help maintain that balance. It's called the swagger. Doing that requires energy. Okay, so walking and while swaying from side to side is not very energy efficient. As I mentioned before, humans are really, really well built for long distance, energy efficient walking. Obviously, there's been a big difference in the foot. So chimpanzees are able to grip with their feet, just like with the hand. Their big toe is not in line with the rest of the feet, so it almost acts like a thumb, and they can use that to hold on to trees and branches as they climb. So it makes them really good climbers. We, however, do not have that. So our foot has changed to become really well suited to walking along the ground. So we've got an arch in our foot, which will act as a shock absorber. So every step that you take, it absorbs a lot of the impact as the foot connects with the ground. And also the big toe has come in line with the rest of the foot. That allows us to do what is called toeing off. So if you, next time you take a step, take note that the big toe is the last piece of your foot that connects with the ground as you take a step. What that does is it propels your foot forward and allows for more energy efficient walking. Another one of the big changes is proportional arm length. Chimpanzees are knuckle walkers, so they need long enough arms for them to connect to the ground. Also, long arms are important to allow them to reach between trees as they're moving through, reach between branches as they're moving through the tree canopy. Obviously, our arms are not required for locomotion. They don't help us get from A to B anymore. Instead, what's happened is they have become shorter and they allow us to carry things, so food, tools, our young, that type of thing. We'll also notice with the shoulder blades as well. Okay, so the shoulder blades have moved more to the back, whereas in chimpanzees, they sit much higher and wider, again, giving them that higher reach to be able to move through the branches. Finally, we've got the hand. So human hands, the palm is much shorter and the fingers are shorter. The thumb has moved up, and we have the dexterity, so the muscles, the ligaments that allow us to do what is called a precision grip. So if you were to hold your pen, you would be doing a precision grip, okay? Whereas if you were to grip something like a branch or bars on a jungle gym, then that is the power grip. So primates generally are able to all do the power grip, but the precision grip, that fine motor movement required for things like writing or tool making, is pretty unique to humans. And once again, that's been able to happen because we no longer require our hands and our arms for getting from A to B and have been able to pick things up and carry things. Also, you'll notice that there's been changes in the brain. And I alluded to this when I was talking about the chimpanzee and the gorilla skulls. Our skulls are, the human skull is built to contain a really large brain, whereas our primates, although they have big brains compared to other species, they're quite small compared to our own. So, for example, a chimpanzee has a brain size of about 450 cubic centimeters, whereas humans are about 1,375 cubic centimeters, so much larger. If you have a look at the brain, you can see that the cerebral cortex, or the outer layer of the brain, in a human is much more folded. That gives a larger surface area. So the cerebral cortex is the part of the brain that is associated with consciousness, thought, memory, that type of thing. And so we have a really highly developed cerebral cortex compared to a chimpanzee. We also have a really large cerebellum, which is this back part of the brain down here, and that is responsible for things like coordination, dexterity, tool use, that type of thing. Finally, we have areas of the brain internally which are called the Broca's bulge and the Wernicke's area, and they have been really important for the formation of speech, which we'll talk about again when we talk about cultural evolution, because the fact that we can communicate with one another and also understand what one another is saying through speech has given our ancestors a really big advantage, because sharing knowledge, sharing ideas, that type of thing. So we talk a lot about bipedalism in this topic. So why is it so important? Why is it considered to be the point that a lot of things changed? Well, at the moment, it's thought that bipedalism has coincided with climate change in Africa. A date for when bipedalism first evolved keeps getting pushed back and back as we find more fossil evidence and understand more about how we put these fossils together. But at the moment, we're thinking it's coincided with dramatic changes in the climate in Africa, moving from forested area to an open grassland. So what we've associated that with is the fact that our ancestors at the time would not have been able to move so easily from tree to tree, instead had to get down from the tree and walk along the ground. So that walking bipedally is a lot more energy efficient than walking on four legs. And so that offered a selection pressure, an adaptive advantage. But it comes with other advantages as well. No longer needing your arms to help you get from A to B mean that you freed the hands, you can carry young, you can start to pick up stones, for example, and then even at some point in the distant future, you start to manipulate them to create tools. Thermoregulation, more of your body surface area is exposed to wind, for example. Africa was getting hotter and drier, so it was thought to be potentially better at cooling, and the ability to see further, so they could see over those tall grasses, things like that, for predators, for rival groups. But it hasn't come also easily. So there are disadvantages. Whilst our spine is pretty impressive in terms of acting as a shock absorber, it's not the ideal spine for holding things upright. So a lot of humans live with back pain, for example. Also, that change in the shape of the pelvis has formed a much more painful birth. So there's this idea of the obstetric dilemma, it's called. So the fact that our brains have gotten a lot bigger, but the birth canal has gotten narrower. So therefore, the way around that is that offspring are born much earlier in their development. That's why a newborn baby is quite helpless compared to something like a newborn lamb, which it can be up and running around after just a couple of hours. So I've taken this exam question from last year's exam and just wanted to run through some of the key points about how you could potentially answer an exam question. So here we've got 4 skulls, so Ardipithecus, Afarensis, Agaster, and Homo sapien. Okay. The question itself asks the reader to identify 2 trends that have caused a change, that have changed over time. So what are 2 changes that we can see from Ardipithecus, our earliest one, through to Homo sapien? So there's a number of things that you could talk about. You could talk about cranial capacity, so brain case size. You talk about brow ridge, zygomatic arches, prognathism. There's a whole range of different ideas. For the sake of time, I'll talk about just 2, and we can go from there. Okay. So the first one that we could talk about would be brow ridge. Okay, so as you can see, from Ardipithecus has quite an obvious pronounced brow ridge compared to Homo sapiens. As they've given you names of fossils and names pictures to use to reference, it's really important that you do talk specifically about the different pictures that you've got in front of you. Okay. Another one would be cranial capacity. Okay, so Ardipithecus and Afarensis have quite small brain cases. Agaster is a little bit bigger, and then Homo sapien is much larger again. So both of those can be linked to diet. Okay. So a selection pressure driving that would be the change in the ability to catch food, for example. So how can we take these fossil trends and use it as evidence to infer lifestyle changes such as diet, locomotion, communication over the past 4 million years? Well, cultural evolution, so lifestyle, okay, and biological evolution are really closely linked, okay? So changes in cultural evolution can cause a change in selection pressure for biological and vice versa. Okay, so I mentioned before that both of these changes, the brow ridge and the cranial capacity, are linked to diet. Okay, so higher nutrients in the diet has led to a brain expansion and also a meat-based diet as opposed to a plant-based diet that we see in Agaster and Homo sapien. And meat eaters, then it's softer, so therefore the brow ridge isn't as pronounced because it doesn't require that support for the chewing muscles. Okay. So how have these trends resulted in the success of the species? Well, success in biology is about survival and reproduction. So anything that's going to give us a survival advantage or increase the likelihood of reproduction is going to be deemed as successful. And it comes into this idea around how this change in diet has really fed into a change in the lifestyle. So for example, moving from the plant-based diet that Ardipithecus and Afarensis would have had into the more meat-based diet of Homo agaster and Homo sapiens meant that they had a much higher protein level in their diet, which led to brain expansion and brain development. This development in the brain led to things like better tools forming, communication, a smaller brow ridge that we see. So overall, these would have impacted and increased the health and survival of the individuals selected for over time. Okay. So that's the biological side of things. I want to just take us through the cultural evolution side of things. So, once again, I have brought home some of our hominin tools. So, cool. The first tool is the older one tools. So there's 4 tool cultures that you want to be familiar with. For each tool culture, you want to know who used it, how it was used, and some of the key features associated with it. So the older one tool is this one. So it was used by Homo habilis. There is some discussion as to whether some earlier species used the older one tools, but we know that habilis did. So the key idea is that the older one tool is just a single sharpened side of a stone. So you can see that this is still quite round, stone-like. So it would have been made by striking one stone against the other to really sharpen a single edge. Okay, so it would have been made from about 5 to 10 blows or strikes to form the sharpened edge. Now, habilis was not a hunter. They were scavengers. So they would wait until apex predators had gone, killed some prey, picked over the bone, and left the carcass. They would then go in and open up those bones, extracting bone marrow using this tool. So it led to a much more nutrient-rich diet that previous ancestors did not have access to. It's at this point that we start to see massive leaps forward in terms of brain development and thought to be associated with this high-fat, high-protein diet that they had access to. The second tool culture is the Acheulean tool culture. So this is associated with Homo ergaster and Homo erectus. Okay, so it's very typical in that it's that bifacial, so both sides, teardropped hand axe. So these guys were not fantastic hunters. They were what we call endurance hunting. So they would follow their prey around for days on end until their prey collapsed, at which point they would rush in and kill it or process the carcass. So it would have been made from approximately 50 blows as opposed to the 5 to 10 of the older one. Our next tool culture is the Mousterian tool culture. So we associate this with the Neanderthals, so Homo neanderthalensis. And it would have been made using the Levasseur method, which is the idea that the Neanderthals would have pre-prepared a piece of flint, so a type of stone, broken off a section and made the tool from that broken off pre-prepared section. It's much more finely worked, so we're looking at around 150 blows as opposed to the 50. Okay, we also see a large variety in the diversity of the tools. So where Acheulean is very typically the hand axe, we start to see very specific tools for very different jobs within Mousterian tools. So for the first time, we see tools for making other tools. And then finally, we've got that Upper Paleolithic tool. So these we associate with our early humans, so Homo sapiens. So made from a range of materials, not just stone, but also bone, antler, wood, okay? Very finely worked, so we're looking at about 250 strikes or blows to make this stone tool as opposed to 5 for our older one. And so what that means is they had they spent a lot of time and effort into making these tools, and very specialized tools doing different things for different jobs. It's in this tool culture that we start to see things like fish hooks, atolls used for throwing as well, all associated with the Upper Paleolithic tool culture. Okay. So these guys, the Neanderthals, were specialist hunters. They were hunting large game, so things like mammoths. So for the first time with Mysterian tool culture, we see them actually putting arrowheads and things on a stick to create a spear. And again, with Homo sapiens, very efficient for hunting, fishing, sewing as well. So finally worked that they were able to use them to sew clothes as well. Okay. All right. So it's important that you understand that the positive feedback mechanism that we see. So with bipedalism, okay, it freed the hands. It allowed our ancestors to pick up stones and start to manipulate those stones to create tools. This in turn changed their diet. They went from a low nutrient, low protein, low fat based diet to a much more nutrient rich diet, which we associate with brain development. Once that brain developed further and further, they started to develop more sophisticated tools. And so this is what I'm referring to with that idea of positive feedback. The tools led to an improved diet, which led to improved brain development, which led to improved tools, and around it goes. But it's not tools are not the only cultural advancement. So there's been lots of other things as well. So fire, the ability to control fire. We know that it was associated with Homo erectus, and it's thought that Homo ergaster would have needed fire to be able to leave Africa. So it's reasonable to assume that ergaster had the ability to control fire as well. Now, I say the ability to control fire instead of discover fire. Fire is a natural phenomenon. Our ancestors would have seen fire, but the ability to actually control it was a big development. It meant that our ancestors were able to keep warm, which allowed them to move into new habitats. So it's thought that ergaster was the first to leave Africa and outside of Africa evolved into Homo erectus sorry, I lost my train of thought, and spread into Europe and Asia. It also allowed them to cook food. Cooked food is a lot easier to digest, so less energy went into digesting and they could get more energy out of it, and kill pathogens as well. Okay. Time spent around the fire also meant that they had an increased social interaction as well. So start to see real social bonds forming, and then later on ancestors used fire for hunting as well to drive herds into particular areas very strategically. Other advancements we see would be the burial of dead. So we first associate that with Neanderthals, and there's advantages to that because it reduces the spread of disease, it doesn't attract scavengers around, and it also shows evidence in a belief in the afterlife. So often the buried dead are placed with flowers or tools or animal bones around them. We know that the animals are not there because they've been killed by the animals. Instead, they've been placed very strategically around the dead. So that's evidence of abstract thought of fulfilling a spiritual need as opposed to a just pure survival need. And then art is another one. So thought to be associated with our early Homo sapiens is really important in terms of recording events, but also in terms of self-expression as well. And finally, we have agriculture. So agriculture is associated with Homo sapiens. It's quite recent, 15 to 10,000 years ago. Our ancestors went from being nomadic hunters to actually settling into a single place and harvesting crops, saving some of the seed, replanting, and doing the same with animals. And that had advantages because it meant that you could harvest your resources at optimal times and then store it up. You also had access to non-food resources, to non-meat, so work animals, for example. Most importantly, it allowed them to stay in one place, build settlements, which led to villages, which led to towns, and a specialisation of labour. So I'll be responsible for looking after the goats if you go and grow the wheat, and we can trade. However, it did come with issues. Diet became a lot less diverse because they were eating foods that they had handy to them, which was much of the same things, as opposed to just foraging whatever they could find. They relied more on weather. So in a bad growing season, it had a pretty dramatic effect. And then a whole lot of individuals living in high density, along with their crops and their animals, led to spread of disease and issues around waste management, that type of thing. So as we draw to close the cultural side of things, we can have a look at a past exam question. So looking at the Paleolithic age, 2.6 million years ago. So that is taking us through older wind tools through to Upper Paleolithic, not farming because that was the Neolithic. We saw evidence of early human technology. So discuss changes in tool culture that came about in the Paleolithic period and what advantages did it offer. So pretty much what changed and how did that allow for their survival. So the difference between cultural evolution and biological evolution. So biological evolution is change through genetics. Passed from parent to offspring, certain alleles might be selected for or against, and it is slow. Whereas cultural evolution is about passing on of knowledge. It doesn't necessarily need to be from parent to offspring. It can be peer-to-peer. It's about sharing ideas, communicating with one another, and is much faster because of it. So it doesn't rely on that generational time. 2, name tool cultures and how that could lead to a change in the lifespan of the population or the species. So again, you could talk about Oldowan, Acheulean, Mousterian, or Upper Paleolithic. Any of the 4 tool cultures have contributed to an increased lifespan of the species associated with them. I chose to talk about the Oldowan tool culture. Habilis allowed them to scavenge food, which opened up new nutrients in that nutrient-rich bone marrow, which again increased their lifespan because they had access to more nutrients in their diet. The other one would be the Mousterian tool culture, so with the Neanderthals. Again, that allowed them to make the move from that long-distance endurance hunting to actually more active hunting using spears, specialized tools to make clothing, for example. The Neanderthals lived in Europe during an ice age, so it's really important that they were able to get enough nutrients to build shelter, to make clothing, to keep warm for their longer lifespan. And finally, discuss how the changes to the tool culture could bring about change in clothing worn and success in hunting or gathering food. So we've touched on some of those ideas earlier. It's perfectly fine to, in an exam, to answer 2 bullet points at the same time. But just to reiterate, Oldowan tools allowed for scavenging, which led to expansion of the brain and therefore better development in tools. So the next tool culture are Acheulean tools. And Mousterians tools allowed for Neanderthals to prepare hides, so they cloaked themselves in animal furs. They didn't necessarily sew like Homo sapiens did, but they were able to fashion some clothing out of animal furs to survive that really cold European climate. Okay, and also allowed them to hunt large prey. These were the Neanderthals were the hunters that hunted mammoths, for example. Okay, so finally into dispersal theories. So pretty much what we've done so far is we've talked about our ancestors. We've gone from the beginning of bipedalism right through to Homo sapiens. The next part of this topic is about, well, okay, so where did Homo sapiens actually evolve? Okay. And there's two theories as to where Homo sapiens evolved. The first is the multi-regional theory, and the second is the out of Africa theory. So I'll talk you through both, and then we'll have a look at the evidence. So the multi-regional theory states that Homo ergaster left Africa 1.8 million years ago, evolved into erectus in Europe and Asia, and we found Homo erectus fossils in Europe and in Asia. What it then goes on to say is that in all three areas, Europe, Africa, Asia, Homo erectus or ergaster evolved into other transitional species, so Heidelbergensis, Neanderthals, and then into Homo sapiens, all in those three regions at the same time. Now, for this to have occurred, it would have relied on gene flow between different populations in those different regions. So that's what we mean by multi-regional, the fact that Homo sapiens evolved in multiple regions. The out of Africa theory states that, yes, well, ergaster left Africa 1.8 million years ago, evolved into erectus in Europe and Asia. Those lineages then went extinct. And it was only in Africa that Homo sapiens evolved. From there, Homo sapiens left Africa approximately, it varies, approximately about 65,000 years ago, and spread into Asia and Europe, but evolved only in Africa. So, looking at the evidence, there is a lot more evidence to support that out of Africa theory. The multi-regional theory can be explained using some fossil evidence. So, for example, they found some fossils that they think might represent hybridization between species. We'll come back to that in a moment. And then also similarities between Homo sapiens found in one area and Homo erectus found in that other area, that same area. But we can also explain that by looking at selection pressures. So what was an advantage in Europe or in Asia for Homo erectus was probably also an advantage in those areas for Homo sapiens, because they would have been exposed to the same selection pressures. However, the out of Africa has a lot more support. It's got fossil evidence that supports it. The oldest fossil Homo sapien fossils have been found in Africa. The next oldest ones are just outside of Africa. But also the DNA evidence supports it, and we're relying more and more on DNA evidence as we get better at extracting DNA from fossils, and we are understanding a lot more around different DNA lineages and things like that. So all of the DNA evidence supports out of Africa. The fact that groups living in Africa today have a greater genetic diversity than all individuals found outside of Africa is an important point. So that links us to the founder effect. If you think about it, there are a small group of individuals 60,000 years ago that left Africa, from which all people of European, Asian, Pacific ancestry are derived from. Okay, and that was only a very small group. So it ties into their founder effect from year 12. mitochondrial DNA. Everybody alive today, no matter their ancestry group they recognize, can link their mitochondrial DNA, so the small amount of DNA in their mitochondria, back to a single female 200,000 years ago. We call her mitochondrial Eve. If multi-regional was correct, we would expect that 200,000 year date to be 1.8 million years ago, when Agasta first left Africa. The Y chromosomes follow a very similar pattern. Males alive today can trace their Y chromosome through their paternal lineage, so father to son, back to Africa. And also artifacts support it as well. So art, pottery, tools found outside of Africa coincide with dates that we thought Homo sapiens first arrived there, according to the out of Africa theory. Yes?
I've got a wee question for you, Emma.
Yeah, sure.
Teresa's asked, can you consider H. ergaster and H. erectus as the same species and state that in both theories Homo erectus left Africa? Or do you think it is important to differentiate between ergaster and erectus?
A lot of people do recognize ergaster and erectus as the same species, and I think in an exam they would accept either. The reason I use ergaster is that it just differentiates that those individuals found in Africa compared to those found in Europe and Asia. So I think in an exam you would be okay to use either, but yeah, hopefully that helps. Cool. So the next thing you want to do is, okay, so out of Africa, we talk about, well, if our ancestors evolved in Africa, how did they get to spreading around the earth? And it's really important to remember that coastlines were different then. It was during a time of ice age, so sea levels were much lower. It means that they could walk places that you couldn't today. But I've put together this kind of general map. So we've got Homo sapiens evolved in Africa approximately 200,000 years ago, according to our evidence using mitochondrial Eve. We know that there was a group that left Africa earlier on but died out. We found fossils in the Middle East around 90,000 years ago. It's thought that a second group left Africa and moved into the Middle East around 60 to 65,000 years ago. And we're talking quite a small group, about 200 individuals, they think. And those ancestors immediately met the Neanderthals. And so there was some interbreeding. So this is where the out of Africa theory has to be tweaked a little bit, because initially it said that there was no interbreeding between Homo sapiens and other species, but we've now had to readjust that, because unless you are of African ancestry or recent African ancestry, you will have between 1 and 2% Neanderthal DNA. And that is thought to be have been really useful for us, because as we move into new areas, we're exposed to new pathogens and new diseases, which can often wipe out a species. But the fact that we bred with the Neanderthals is often thought that we got some genes associated with their immune system, and that allowed us to survive those pathogens found outside of Africa. So very handy. So there wasn't a lot of breeding. It was thought to be one breeding event every generation or so. So there wasn't a whole lot of intermixing between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, but there was some. For a long time, it was thought that we were responsible for the deaths of the Neanderthals, that we killed them, but they've never found any evidence for that. In fact, what's likely to have led to their extinction was the fact that as the Ice Age ended, they were really well built for cold climates, and so instead they became physiologically stressed, and that was around the same time that our ancestors were moving out of Africa and started to outcompete them, okay, with our more advanced tools, our trade networks, that type of thing. So very quickly did Homo sapiens spread from Africa along coastlines and down through Southeast Asia and into the Pacific. Okay, so Southeast Asia, Melanesia, Australia, and they not only met the Neanderthals, but met a second group called the Denisovans. So the Denisovans are a group of individuals we don't know a huge amount. They either lived, we know that we found fossils up in the Denisovan caves up in Russia, but also we think that our ancestors would have taken this coastline pathway, so likely would have lived throughout this area here in order for them to have met. So they are people of Melanesian descent, so there is things like through the Pacific, Papua New Guinea, Vanuatu, Australia, things like that. They have a small amount of Denisovan DNA as well. Also, the people of Tibet, their ancestry in Tibet, they have some Denisovan DNA. In fact, it's thought that they have genes, got genes associated with living at high altitudes from the Denisovans. So they were very handy to have come across. Finally, it was much later that our ancestors moved into Europe and a second wave into Asia, and that's to do with climate. So this is during the Ice Age. So they stuck very much around the equator area to begin with, and only once the Ice Age started to end did they move north into those colder regions. There's thought to have been like large glaciers potentially blocking the way, their access and things like that. So that's just a quick run through of the migration pathways. And finally, just to take us through one last question associated with dispersal. So this is about an unknown species. So Homo luzonensis. So you're not expected to know anything about this species. I mentioned before there are some species that you are expected to know a little bit about, the ones that we've talked about, but you might be introduced to a completely new species, but you would be given information that you need about them. So you wouldn't necessarily be expected to just know all this information about them off the top of your head. So this species was found in the Philippines, okay, on the island of Luzon, okay, and has some similarities that we associate with Homo sapiens, but also was quite primitive and earlier in some of their features, so similar to the Australopithecus afarensis species, or Lucy. So it's not 100% sure where they fit, but they have dated the fossils back to 67,000 years ago. So if we have a look through, there's actually thought to have been maybe potentially 3 species living in that area at that given time. Another one is Homo floresiensis. You may have heard of this one, a very small ancestor nicknamed the Hobbit on the island of Flores until about 50,000 years ago, so until quite recently. So if we look at the questions or the bullet points, discuss how the discovery of this new species enables scientists to adjust their understanding of the out of Africa theory. So pretty much it wants you to talk about start off with what is the out of Africa theory. Sometimes it's referred to as the replacement model, so they'll use both those words in an exam. So the theory states that Homo sapiens evolved in Africa and then spread around the world, replacing earlier hominins. So that's where that word replacement comes from. So pretty much what is the theory? Now, it then goes on to talk about an explanation, so how or why of what knowledge mitochondrial DNA or nuclear DNA would provide to scientists. So it's said in the context of the question that they have been unable to extract DNA from these fossils due to the conditions that they were found in. This is pretty common. DNA isn't that stable, but we have been able to get some DNA from our fossils. And it's really important because it tells the scientists a lot. So, for example, DNA from the nucleus can be extracted and then sequenced, and it can be compared to our own DNA, or it might be compared to DNA from other fossils that we've been able to sequence. So it tells us a lot about where certain alleles evolved and when. And from that, we can infer a lot about their lifestyle. So, for example, the mutation that allows adults to process lactose tells us a lot around the domestication of animals and when that would have been selected for. Mitochondrial DNA is also a really useful tool. So the thing about mitochondrial DNA, that small fragment of DNA in your mitochondria, is it doesn't get reshuffled every generation. It doesn't get combined with between parents. It gets passed on from mother to child. And so because it doesn't get reshuffled, you use it as a molecular clock. So you might make an assumption that there's one change every, say, generation. And then you can compare the mitochondrial DNA between groups and work out when these groups last shared were last part of a common group or were last joined together. So you use it as kind of a clock, and a lot of research is being done around that at the moment. And finally, explain how endocranial features and how these features may have aided migration out of Africa. So endocranial is just a fancy word for saying brain. So endo means inside, cranial, skull. Inside the skull is your brain. So pretty much brain features and how they aided migration out of Africa. So we're going to link back to what we talked about earlier on in the biological evolution. Remember, I said it, biology, culture, and migration are all really closely linked together. So, for example, the formation of the parts of the brain associated with speech, the Broca's bulge, the Wernicke's area, which is language comprehension, would have been really important to share knowledge, to share ideas, that cultural evolution around fire and hunting, which would have allowed our ancestors to be so successful as they moved out of Africa into new areas, into new habitats and climates. So hopefully that all makes sense. The question itself doesn't actually require you to know anything about the species Homo luzonensis, but instead asks you to talk about what evidence scientists could use and how could this adjust their model, their understanding. Cool. So that is a really fast-paced walk through the last 6 million years. So hopefully you've taken something out of it, and have, if you've got any questions, just let me know.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Emma. I feel that you're outdoing yourself each time with the quality of your slides. And I think I might have to steal a copy of that presentation. That was awesome. Really enjoyed that. And thank you so much for bringing the props in from your school as well. It was really cool to be able to see the tools and the skulls as you were talking through there. There's no further questions at the moment, so I think we'll wrap up there. But just once again, Emma, thank you so much for all your time and effort in putting together some really such high quality presentations there.
Cool. Thank you. No worries at all.
Thank you.
Later.
Thanks, everyone.
Cool. Sorry,
Okay.
I